Welcome to the ITAD Talk podcast with your host, Jeff Bittner.
So I'd like to introduce my guest this morning, and it's Daniel Lobanovsky, and he is the sales in ITAD at Terabit Systems. And Daniel has over a decade of purchasing and sales experience in the secondary market, specializing in end-user and broker sales for Arista and Juniper networking hardware. So I'd like to say welcome to you, and thanks for being on our podcast.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. And yeah, please excuse me if I don't reply quick enough because this is officially the first podcast I've ever done. So
Okay.
thanks for having me.
Sure. Yeah, you're very welcome. So do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe how you got into the industry?
Sure. So myself, I was grew up, born and raised in San Francisco, California, and went to college over at USF and did my thing and jammed out to Japan for about 6 to 8 years, and eventually came back to the U.S. and had a degree in economics. So I thought, oh, why don't I merge? At that time, I had a bit of a sales background, and why don't I merge that with economics and go into finance? And got into finance, and that lasted until about 2008. I was on the sales desk for a company that basically did venture capital loans and heavy equipment leasing. And I think you remember 2008, yes. We had the collapse in the US. So I was looking for something else to do after the sales desk went from like 6, 5, 4, 3.
Oh my gosh. How scary.
And it was, but it was actually, in retrospect, one of the best things that could have happened to me. So I was a little tired at that time of finance because I didn't feel I was selling anything tangible. That was for myself. So, I basically would sell a product and move on, and I wasn't developing any long-term relationships or anything like that. But I didn't even realize it at that time because I didn't even know what that meant. But I had a friend of a friend who was starting a business in IT network hardware, and I had heard about the industry when I lived in Santa Barbara. There was, at the time, it was called NHR, but it's Curvature now, and It's bought by somebody else since. But you buy and sell this network equipment gear, and generally it turned into more of selling network equipment gear for them. But so I met up with this friend who started this company, Terabit Systems, named Brian Stadmiller, and he focused on off-brands because it was, at the time, and it's even more so now, like a crowded industry, but at the time it was like Cisco. Everybody did Cisco. So we focused on Brocade, which was essentially Foundry, IP Ethernet hardware, not their SAN gear. And Brian had found a niche with a lot of clients that he developed in the Netherlands. And I said, well, I've worked in Japan. Maybe I could develop some Japanese clients, which I did. And we also had a Japanese web page and everything as well. I got a translator to work on that.
So a quick question on that. So were you then shipping back and forth internationally, or did you guys set up like a satellite office over there?
Nope, no satellite offices, just phone calls in the evening, trying to impress Japanese junk dealers with my language skills. And,
I was just about to ask, do you speak the language or a little bit?
I do. I took Japanese in college. I got a minor in it, and then I studied quite a bit extensively to the point where I could become like a technical translator for this department. I worked for JCB, which was the Japan Credit Bureau, and I worked for their sales side in the U.S., and then I moved to Japan, and lo and behold, the guy who had been working for them for 10 years was like, yeah, I want to leave. And my manager in the U.S. put in a good word for me, and I got the job. And I didn't know much Japanese, but I wouldn't say to the technical level, but yeah.
So here's one more question. When you were living over there, did you end up dating some of the Japanese girls? I'm just curious.
I was not only dating, but I was also married to a Japanese woman.
Really?
And that could be a whole podcast in itself.
I'm kind of curious. So, like, was she kind of like the traditional girl and kind of did the tea ceremonies and things like that, or?
Not so much. I was young at the time. I was 25. She was 21, getting out of school, and I had met her through an English teaching job that I had. And it's this story. If you talk to a foreigner who's taught in Japan, you'd probably hear a million times over. But the most interesting part about this time too is like, pre-iPhone, pre-everything, like getting around Tokyo, it's like survive or die. And so I think that really forces you into, either getting a girlfriend or a boyfriend or someone who's a native there. And you really enjoy the country a lot more too that way. But yeah, so we made the kind of quick decision to get married, and that lasted only, after I think 2.5 years, it pretty much fell apart. But I stayed in Japan a little bit longer, and then said it's time to come home.
Gotcha. Okay, and then from there you moved to San Francisco?
I did. I moved back. My mom was in San Francisco. She had sold a house, moved up to Sonoma. So I planted myself in Sonoma for a couple months till I found a job, and then I moved to Santa Barbara, where that's when I got onto another sales position, which was the sales desk at John Hancock. And that was a fun job. But then eventually got my Series 6, then my 63, then my Series 7, and moved back to San Francisco. And that's where I ended up in the company right before I went into network hardware.
And so that's where you live currently, is in San Francisco?
San Rafael now, actually, okay. Which is right north of San Francisco.
So just like as a baseline, what does it cost to rent a 1 or 2 bedroom place there now?
Oh, wow. So San Francisco, when I came back, I guess this was around 2008, you could rent a 1 bedroom for $1,300.
Oh, okay. That's not too bad.
No, I guess not. But at the time, that was probably, I don't know, you'd put half of what you earned into rent, if not a little bit less. So it was expensive. But yeah, I think you'd get a 1 bedroom around that rate. Then I had moved to another 1 bedroom apartment. I got that for $1,500, came with parking. And I literally stayed there for about 12 years until we moved up over to San Rafael. But I mean, now you're looking in San Francisco at like, I'm assuming, when I left my apartment, I know it went up. The rent went from $1,500 to $3,250.
Oh my gosh! That was for like a 1 bedroom.
1 bedroom in the western part of the city, which is like by Ocean Beach, less desirable, blah blah blah. Huh. But it was kind of catching on. So I think, and at the time we were looking for houses in San Rafael, so renting a house was like $5,000 a month. Yeah, around there, 5 to 6.
Huh.
But yeah, so that's another one of the challenges in the Bay Area is you always have to find kind of the hustle that works for you, and hardware has been one of those. So
like for your staff, I mean, I know everybody's having trouble hiring people now. So like your technicians and stuff. So is it hard for them, or you just have to pay, huge premium to get people, or?
That's really, really a good question, because I'd say 10 years ago when we started the business, it was kind of like, okay, everyone hangs on and does their thing. But it would be much harder to get, I would say, younger talent now. Because I think we're going to touch upon this too, but how did you get into networking equipment and why?
Yes.
And I don't know anybody. I have not yet met one person who is in this industry by design.
Okay.
So that's always a really interesting thing. I've met people who have come out of like hardware sales, but not necessarily who wanted to go into like used hardware sales or procurement. So it's tough. We have people here in the Bay Area that I think have had established jobs earlier. They didn't get into this industry and work their way on up, so to say. Like the techs had, worked at Cisco for a while, maybe got tired of that environment, wanted something more laid back. of course, the pay and the benefits and everything are very different. But yeah, I don't think San Francisco or a very overhead heavy location is where you'd want to start a business like this today at all.
I'm curious too, like when you're working with, corporate clients, and since you do specialize in the networking gear, because like, for example, we cater to the decommissioning of data center IT assets, for example, and it's usually like where you go in and they kind of want you to take, at least all the IT gear, or maybe they break it down into the IT gear, and then you've got, the generators and flooring and so on. So I'm just kind of curious, how does that relate to how you guys do business, and how are you kind of able to separate specifically the networking gear from the rest of the gear that's coming out?
We will just sell pieces off. If we have a takeout of that nature, that's either something we won't bid on, or we'll have a partner who's interested in that. A lot of times things like PDUs or whatever, they go for very, very little money.
Right.
And
they're heavy.
Yeah, they're heavy, right? So you're not going to move those around that much, although there's a demand for them. And I've met people who specialize in them, but they may live in Kansas, where they have a lot more space available to them. But the funny thing is we also compete, with companies that are based in the Midwest or, somewhere in the Northeast. So the fact that and this is an interesting question too, because someone asked me at a trade show recently, it's like, well, why that hardware? And I was like, good question. Didn't really think about it all that much, but it's essentially where the money is in networking. The routing and the switching components are much higher dollar. They tend to hold their value a little bit longer, and you have to move less bulk of it than, say, something like servers or storage equipment. And I think just the expense of the shelf space in San Francisco kind of dictated what we do. So
tell us a little bit more about when you kind of started working there, and then the transition of the industry, and kind of like, has there been any changes? And, because you mentioned that you're kind of specializing in that type of equipment. Are there any kind of changes that are going on?
Sure. Yeah, big time. So when we started, we focused on, again, routing and switching hardware from Brocade, which at that time had just purchased Foundry, and they had come out with this MLX or MLXC lineup. And you started looking at these cards and you go, oh, wow, 10. So everything was going from 1 gig to 10 gig. Then, the next hop was currently what we're dealing with. 40 was kind of there, but not completely there. The big one has been 100 gig. So we're helping a lot of clients, I guess, smaller to mid-sized companies who 100 gig was sort of out of the question, or wasn't even a need for them a couple years ago, pretty much desperately needing it now, which sucks because everything slowed down with the supply chain. And normally where, they'd be paying a lot less for this kind of gear, they're actually paying slightly proportionately more for it now, just because of the way everything's constrained.
So a question on the gear, because I know a lot of the companies have their own software. Are you, do you have like some certifications with the manufacturer to be able to do resets, or is that not needed for those types?
No, we don't. You can't charge for anything like software or something like that, obviously. But yeah, we have techs that are proficient or versed in whatever operating system it is. For Juniper, it's Juno, Cisco, EOS, and there's similarities, I guess more so with Arista and Cisco than there is with Juniper. But I'm not. That's another thing for myself as a salesperson, is I definitely try not to position myself as an engineer, someone who like deeply knows the technical side of things. But Well, sorry, I guess I lost track of that question there.
No, I think that was it. And then you're talking about the transition going to the
Yes.
from the 40 gig to the 100 gig. So where's as the 100 gig material kind of come out of like the telecoms? Is that kind of where a lot of that stuff, or more of the data centers, or a little bit of both?
Yes, absolutely. Previous, cloud companies, telecoms, data centers. 100 gig. And now the thing is people are looking to bump up, and it's already out there. They're just having trouble sourcing the optics, so it's not completely usable. But 400 gig is out there from, Juniper,
Wow.
Arista, Nokia, which had purchased Alcatel-Lucent. That's the next jump we're seeing. And we're not seeing any of our clients yet asking for 400 gig equipment to us directly, because it's so new that we have clients that sometimes will purchase new hardware and used hardware and sort of supplement their budget or save money by buying used hardware. That's definitely one of the sales pitches or approaches when you start talking to people. But we couldn't even provide 400 gig if we were asked for it. So
if you get a pretty good size load in, how long does it typically take for the inspection process and the techs to go over it and to kind of wipe the operating system and so on?
That's, I'd say something like a pallet of 100 switches can take, a couple of techs, a week maybe.
Okay, gotcha.
But it doesn't take them a week of full time. That's a week in between doing orders, and getting.
Right. Well,
gear out
it seems
as
like
well.
when you're bringing in used gear, there's always, a lot of little things. Maybe there's small components that need to be replaced, or a corner, or things like that too, as you're going through. And so, or maybe one of the systems gets hung and as you're trying to get into the operating system. So it's definitely kind of a whole process. I was curious too, what type of, do you have like any certifications that go along with that industry? Like, for example, since we're an ITAD company also, we're doing R2 and so on.
Yeah. None for us. Okay. So years ago, we brought up, why not get certified? And there were some hurdles involved, and we just didn't pursue it any further than that. So I think another thing that's interesting about our industry is you look at it, and when you say, oh, how much gear can you go through and what do you do? There's like maybe 3 300-pound, 800-pound gorillas in the room. And then there's just a bunch of us. So and by us, I mean companies that do between, $5 and $10 million in revenue a year. And those operations are generally no more than, a few well-seasoned salespeople, people who work in tech, and then some people who handle kind of like the back office and managerial processes. So they're pretty tightly run ships.
Yeah, that's really important. Especially, since you're in an area where the labor is expensive and the cost of living. That's important to be able to operate with an efficiency in your industry.
We invite you to follow and subscribe to the ITAD Talk podcast, your source for conversations with luminaries, visionaries, and innovators in the fields of business and technology. You can find the latest episode at itadtalk.com and on all your favorite podcast apps. And don't forget, the best way to support ITAD content is to rate and like the show on iTunes, Google, Spotify, or anywhere you might listen.